everyone for being here. I'm really glad that you all could make it for the final session in the Finance Forum. So this panel is going to discuss what is the best way forward for investors to challenge companies that are falling behind on their climate commitments, whether that is through divestment or engagement. And I have to admit that I come to this from a very different perspective because I found climate court, so my background is in climate litigation. So I was also really amused listening earlier to all of the other sessions in the Finance Forum because I think that my approach to what to do with companies that are falling behind on climate commitments is very different from what these panelists are going to share today, which is why I'm really looking forward to learning more about what everyone is going to say, and as much as you all are. Today I really do come in peace, so I'm really excited to learn what you have to say. And with me today are, first of all, Valeria Piani, who is the head of Stewardship at Phoenix Group. Second, we have Adam Gillett, who is the climate lead at Railpen. And finally, we have Penny Fowler, who is the head of corporate climate at ShareAction. So I'm very open to anyone else sharing questions with us today. I'll have them on the iPad here. So if you have anything that you want to know from any one of these panelists, please do share. So to jump right in, the conversation about climate and climate change is often positioning divestment strategies and engagement strategies as if it's a very binary debate. And I am very much wanting to know your perspective on this. Do you think it's a binary debate, or is there more nuance to it? Adam, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is very strange talking to myself, but I'll give it a go. So I do think it's nuanced, and I do think it's often reduced to this either or, and in quite an antagonistic setting as well. My starting point is I actually think there are at least 4 options, and at Railpen and myself, and I know lots of other people, we do all 4 of those very genuinely. So you can own something and engage with it. You can own something and not engage with it. And to be honest, that's what an awful lot of people do a lot of the time, including ourselves. You can not own it and not engage, and you can not own it and engage still. And that's a bit of a 4th hidden one that people sometimes forget about, but can be really potent. And so across those 4 options, I think there are 2 that are underplayed and under-discussed. And then there's a huge amount of nuance within certainly the engagement one, but also how you divest and the work that you can do around that. And I know that Valeria and others will certainly talk about the different nuances in terms of how engagement can progress and how you can escalate that, and the different ways in which you can use your rights of ownership and the adjacent rights that come with that. So I hope that we can stick to a peaceful panel rather than an antagonistic one, but I do think that there's much, much more to the question than just an either or and what it's sometimes reduced into.
And Valeria, what about you?
Yes, I think I would agree that it cannot be a black and white situation. I like to see it as more like a staircase where you engage and you escalate over the time with different tools available to you, and divestment is really at the other spectrum of your staircase. We do take an engagement approach first when we talk about climate change and engagement with companies in our portfolios. We do have an exclusion list we start from, which is more related to companies we think we cannot even engage with, or we will not have a high likelihood of change, or companies that just by definition do things and have practices in place that they're not compatible with our sustainability strategy, like exploring the Arctic or oil sands or tobacco producers to go beyond climate change. But once we have excluded these cases, we're talking about 500 names, not a big number, then it's about engaging. And we do this individually, in-house, as a large asset owner in the UK, but we also do it through our asset managers in a delegated fashion. In all these cases, we would expect also the managers to take a staircase approach. And before you get to a situation where, after engaging for several years, you decide to divest, you might want to consider other tools that you have available. You could vote against over a certain period of time if you're not progressing enough according to the engagement objectives you set. You could go public, you could have an AGM statement read in front of the board and in front of the public about your concerns, or also as a way to recognizing progress that the company has made. You can write letters to the board, you can write in the newspapers about positions that you want to take on a sector. So there are very many different nuances. It's important that you consider all the toolkit of shareholder activism when you talk about engagement and divestment.
And Penny?
Can you hear me? Great. Good. I wasn't sure if this one was working. Hi everybody, it's really good to be here today. So I am from ShareAction, which is not an investor but is a non-governmental organisation based in the UK that aims to define and promote the adoption of the strongest possible definition of responsible investment. So I'm bringing a slightly different non-investor perspective, but ShareAction does work closely with many investors and have worked on active ownership over more than a decade. And from our experience of kind of leading and facilitating collaborative investor engagements with companies, we've seen in practice many times how the use of more strong escalation tools can certainly help to drive change. And so we would see divestment as an important tool within an investor's toolkit. But like the others have said, in fact, ShareAction recently published a guidance paper on escalation, setting out an escalation framework, starting from kind of private persuasion, which can involve meetings, letters, correspondence, moving to broader challenge where you might go public about the engagement activities you're undertaking, through to the use of shareholder rights, such as voting, as Valeria has already mentioned, whether that's on standing items, as AGM agendas, or else on shareholder resolutions, also obviously filing resolutions, and then you get into the area of capital allocation decisions and potentially partial divestment or the ultimate tool of divestment. But to kind of pose the divestment and engagement as the opposite side of the coin, I would agree with the other two speakers, is not quite correct, because even when you have divested, you can continue to engage. And I think that academic studies, in fact, have shown that the most effective engagement is that includes a public element or the potential for divestment ultimately. So some consequence coming as a result of that divestment. And studies have also shown that a combination of engagement tools, the useful combination of engagement tools rather than just one, is also the most effective way to drive change.
All right, thank you. And Valeria, in your business, in your company, can you walk us through the factors that you consider when you're deciding between engagement or divestment, or a combination of factors?
So, as I mentioned before, one step will be our exclusion policy that is taking more on a rules-based approach. But once that has been considered and applied, then we will take a thematic angle. So in the case of climate change, for example, we have identified 25 names. They're associated with 42% of our finance emissions across everything we hold in equity and fixed income. So quite a relevant list of companies, a small number, but relevant in terms of emission representation. We selected them also because they were not just particularly emitting companies, but also because they weren't looking so great from a forward-looking perspective. So at the time we were selecting the companies, we noticed they didn't have strong targets, for example. They were not necessarily in line with a 1.5 scenario. Once we started the engagement program, then we took a very deep dive approach. We actually researched every single company, and we really tailor our conversation. So we look at the gaps and we define engagement objectives associated with those gaps. So we're not asking exactly the same thing across the sectors that we're engaging with. And we take into consideration where the company has started the journey. On a constant basis, and every time we meet the companies, we reassess progress against these engagement objectives. So at every certain point, we know where we are in the journey of engagement. And based on this progress, then we take those steps that I mentioned before in terms of escalation. if after 3 years, we're not there yet, we only have been doing this for 1 year, but if after 3 years the companies we're engaging with have progressed on less than 25% of our engagement objectives tailored to them, then we will propose these companies for divestment. At that point, we will have to have a conversation with our managers because our investments are totally outsourced. So the managers are the one managing the money for us. We will have to assess the materiality of that investment and then decide if at that point we can take the companies out. But you can appreciate that's a very long-term process where you also need to allow the companies to understand what you're asking for, equip themselves to act, invest in the change, and then disclose about it. So as a minimum, you need to allow the companies 3 years' time, in our view, to show progress.
And Adam, what about at Railpen?
There's a lot of overlap with that. We do have an exclusion policy we start with. It's some usual suspects in tar sands and thermal coal. We also have a governance-based laggard process as well that we do each year, and that's a quite neat example. It's kind of parallel to the climate theme, but it's exactly this conversation around engaging with a company with a very clear threat of divestment, having a small number that we do divest, but then continue to engage through the subsequent years to look for improvement with an ability to readmit them to the program. So there is that base layer in place. We similarly cut through our universe. We actually manage the majority of our assets in-house and the vast majority of our listed equities in-house. And we do so in quite a few concentrated portfolios as well, which helps narrow the field down a little bit. I've got a slightly longer list of my engagement program that I look at, but with different companies you might go into different layers of depth and you might use different tactics with those as well. And again, it's a similar program of having clear engagement objectives, understanding the nuance of the company, tailoring it to that, respecting the relationship that you have with the company, respecting the reason why it's a positive to hold the company as well as the change that you're trying to drive, and then looking for the full toolkit of the things that you've got available. We've mentioned a little bit the direct engagement we do, the collaboration we do as well. That's a really important part. So we're part of Climate Action 100+, part of the Net Zero Engagement Initiative and so forth. And those groups together can be really, really powerful. And so we're on around a dozen, a bit more than that, nearly up to 20 Climate Action 100+ groups, either as a co-lead or a contributor, and a couple on the Net Zero Engagement as well. And then in terms of the thematics, what we try and do is combine that individual company work with some broader themes that cut across. And so a couple of those, for example, include climate lobbying, which is a hugely critical issue and problem and has been a massive barrier to progress on climate over the last 30, 40 years. And so that's something that cuts across all of our companies. And that's something that you can apply, for example, through a broad voting policy where you can have a more rules-based approach that gets across the broad universe that you hold, as well as some deep dive engagements. And then audit and accounting is another really critical point, and I think that's a bit of a nerdle and kind of grip point with lots of companies where you can, again, ask for very specific change. It can reveal really important key things about their strategy and their forward-looking plans, and also ties neatly to the cycle of AGMs, the cycle of disclosures, and the ability to escalate through that as well. So yeah, lots of overlap. I'd just add on those points on collaboration, which I know that Phoenix do an awful lot on, as well as those kind of thematic overlays that we also try to cut across our universe with.
And Penny, in your experience working with investors, what are some of the main challenges that they face when they pursue engagement strategies?
Sure. So we kind of hear from investors and about quite a number of different challenges that they can face when engaging with companies, but I'll focus down on two key ones that we hear about probably most frequently, perhaps. Limited knowledge, time and resources to do the engagement across this broader range of companies as they'd ideally like to do, which requires prioritisation then in terms of engagement priorities. The team that I lead at ShareAction, we decided to focus our climate work currently on decarbonisation in the European chemical sector. And part of the reason we chose that was we felt it was a kind of under-scrutinised sector, and I think a number of investors were, particularly the smaller investors that don't necessarily have specialist capacity or analysis, were struggling to have the confidence and the knowledge to engage effectively with those companies, which are going to be hugely important to achieve the transition we need by 2050. And so we often hear that this can be a big challenge for companies, and this is where the benefit of joining collaborative engagement initiatives can really help, both in terms of providing an opportunity for support and facilitation of those engagements, but also sharing knowledge and information about sometimes quite technical, complex issues where you're going up against, say, chemical engineers in a chemicals company. It's quite intimidating to do that sometimes. We also hear challenges about kind of capacity to engage at AGMs or in terms of filing resolutions, sometimes because of a lack of knowledge or experience, and the kind of requirements to do that in different jurisdictions can vary greatly. And so again, there's a lot of support out there for investors to tackle and share information about how to do that properly. So that's kind of one challenge that we hear quite a lot about. On the other side, we sometimes hear about concerns about maintaining a relationship with a company and the fear of damaging that relationship through going too hard and too strong in terms of engagement, and particularly in terms of escalation. And I think investors will often value their relationships with companies, the access they get, and want to have a constructive dialogue with those companies and to be supportive of their efforts to transition. But where these concerns can, we sometimes find that these concerns can get in the way, and it can also, in the current context of a bit of an anti-ESG backlash and some of the concerns, particularly for investors with big exposure in the US, there's concerns about going public about the engagements that they're doing because of a fear of criticism for the work that they're doing there. But our view would be that divestment, even ultimately, or even the other kinds of stronger forms of escalation activities, are not inconsistent with having a constructive dialogue with a company. What's key is being really clear and communicating expectations to the company and timeframes, for example, as Valeria's pointed out in the example of Phoenix Group's work, so that a company understands what you're looking for within what time frame you're expecting them to ask. And then I think you can maintain that constructive relationship whilst being very challenging where necessary, where progress isn't being made.
Thank you. And if you consider the recent litigation by ExxonMobil against more activist shareholders in their company, how is this affecting the industry that you're all active in as a whole? Adam, do you want to take that?
Sure. Can't see any banana skins here. So I would say Exxon suing their shareholders is deeply concerning. We don't currently directly own Exxon ourselves, and therefore, in terms of our response to it, and my response, our organisational response to it, we don't have some of the tools and options available to us, such as registering dissenting votes at their AGM. And so our engagement there is often through our partners, some of our asset managers who may hold them, but also through the wider industry and advocating around the topic of shareholder rights, which we do an awful lot of, and through some specific organisations, particularly those that are US-based, so groups like Ceres and CII are fabulous. And then I sit back and applaud groups like Brunel, who I think it was last week very publicly declared and pre-declared their intentions on that, and are taking the step to call out the issue very boldly and bravely and say why they think it's a massive problem and what they're going to do about it and how they're escalating it. So I can amplify their voice in their absence and hopefully don't do it discredit during that. So I do see it as deeply worrying, and I do worry if others follow and tuck in behind Exxon if it goes in that direction of limiting shareholder rights and their ability to be strong advocates as an owner of a company. That's very, very problematic. And one of the points that you can make around engagement, whether it's not specific to maybe an individual company, whether it's a more thematic one or a market-based one, which is also really important engagement, is that so much of what we are doing here is reliant on the foundations of strong, protected investor rights and abilities. And so the erosion of those is a real issue. That's not just Exxon suing their shareholders, but it's also potentially some of the changes coming or being proposed to the UK listing rules, for example, and also things like dual-class share structures, which Railpen has been really vocal and active on. And so I think that whenever we're trying to do stuff, I certainly recognise the resource constraint. You've got to look across the piece and not forget some of the foundations that all of the kind of extra work, the intelligent escalation, the deep dive engagement is based on. And some of that is the fundamental shareholder rights that are actually really under threat at the moment, particularly in the US, but also here at home with our listings rules.
Thank you. And Valeria, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we probably echo the same concerns as filing shareholder resolution has been a common practice, especially in some regions like US, for example. It's part of the toolkit, and actions like this could be undermining an important part of the toolkit. And I think companies should just feel comfortable to include the rationale on why they don't agree on a shareholder resolution in the proxy, explain the rationale of it, having very solid arguments on the reason for it. And we've seen a lot of it. In other situations, we actually seen companies agreeing with the shareholder resolutions and actually inviting shareholders to support a resolution. That direction also works. So let's not try to undermine such an important tool for us as shareholders. I also feel the SEC rules are very clear in the US. So when you get a shareholder resolution that you feel is micromanaging or is immaterial because focusing on a small percentage of your operation, or is part of the ordinary business, or has been already filed several times with no support, you can actually challenge it with SEC. You have that tool available as a company. So why actually going through a legal action? And that's what I think is quite an extreme situation. I've been encouraged by seeing some comments from legal opinions in the US saying that even if this case goes in the wrong direction, not necessarily will be replicated, but I think we are all watching and monitoring very carefully. We don't vote our shares directly as an organization. Voting power are still with our managers, and we cannot actually even have a conversation with them before the AGM because of distractions we have and how large we are. But we're definitely going to monitor how our managers will look at the Exxon ballot, and we will have post-vote conversations to understand if they actually have been looking at this and potentially express discontent based not just on the content of the resolution that couldn't be filed, but also on the measure itself that the company took.
Okay. And I think it's interesting to ask this question. It's from the audience. So someone asked, do we need to make persistent high emitters uninvestable through regulation to increase costs and correcting market failures? Penny, maybe do you want to take this one?
Sorry, I'm just struggling a bit with my headphones. So I think ultimately there is going to be a role to play, an important role for government to play in the transition that we need to see. And so there follows quite an important and interesting question about the role of investors in policy dialogue and public policy debates, I think. We know that currently the incentives are not right for companies to transition in all areas. It's more cost-effective to use the old technologies than to use the newer technologies. And so I think there's a strong case to be made for public intervention to kind of provide the right incentives to encourage that shift until we reach that tipping point and those new technologies become economically viable. So for sure, that's very true, an important role for government. And I think that there is a case that could be made that divestment or divestment activities kind of ultimately, depending on the number of investors that get involved, can send a very strong signal and help to create market norms and potentially influence public policy ultimately in this regard. But as has already been outlined, I think that kind of process of engaging and trying to support change is important. But there will be some companies that are either unable or unwilling to transition, and that's where this tool does come into effect.
All right, very clear. And another question that we got is, can we talk about the need for an updated understanding of the fiduciary duty? Valeria, maybe you want to take that one?
Well, I'll go back to what it was said before. We do this primarily because it's embedded in fiduciary duties. So we do have to protect the long-term value of investment for our customers. We protect 12 million of customers in the UK, in Ireland, in Germany. So we need to look at where we invest, and we need to engage to try to decarbonize the business model of the companies. Again, the role of our manager also plays crucial. So I told you that we, for example, engage with 25 names on climate change. Our managers engage with 1,000 in 2023, so the scale is huge compared to what we do. So I think it's important from an asset owner perspective that we do a little bit of it in-house to understand actually what it means, how much you can challenge the companies, so you understand the real barriers and challenges per sector. And then you get this knowledge to and make it very precious when you engage with your manager to understand actually how they are doing the same when they engage with the companies, and try as much as possible to get alignment. There's a little bit of asymmetry of information in the entire value chain, from the asset owner to the asset managers, from the asset managers to the companies. So it's important that we equip ourselves with the knowledge that we need to then feel comfortable to challenge the companies and challenge the managers. And I feel this is all part of the fiduciary duty of institutional investors.
And Adam, what are your views on the impact of divestment on cleaning up your own balance sheet while the holding moves to being a less active shareholder? This is another from the audience.
Sure, that's certainly a worry that some people put forward around investors who have previously been engaged and pushing on a positive climate transition trajectory, walking away and being replaced. However, that comes through in the secondary market with those that are maybe less interested or less well-resourced or less able to do so. So that's certainly a concern. I think the reality is that a lot of the sectors that we'll spend our time with, and a lot of the companies that we'll spend our time engaging with, will be in business for the coming years and decades, whether we personally like that fact or not, and whether that causes irreparable harm to our planet and climate or not. And if these companies are going to be in existence and operations, then the kind of best and bottom line of that is that they do it in the most ESG integrated, people and planet friendly way possible. And so there is certainly a role for staying invested and staying engaged, even if the business model isn't fundamentally changing too much in terms of its operations and outputs, but does it in the kind of best and least harmful way possible. And so that's certainly a worry if you walk away from a business, because that won't in itself shut it down. The other thing that I think is in that question is a notion of sorting out your own portfolio and your own balance sheet versus a kind of wider market and system that you'll depend on. At Railpen, we're largely an open DB pension scheme, so our liabilities run into the next century. And we're heavily invested in these companies, and I think the longer your time horizon is and the broader you paint your mission, and we have a pretty broad mission in terms of our purpose of securing our members' futures, there's a lot of duality in that, then the more closely tied your ultimate outcomes will be to the health and wealth of the market, of the people and planet. The shorter your time horizons are, probably there's a little bit of distance that you can pull from there. But for us, the success of our ability to deliver pensions and pension outcomes to our members is inextricably tied to the health of people and planet. And so our own portfolio is kind of a snapshot of that from day to day and from year to year. But over the super long horizon, we're going to own the market and pieces of it through time. And therefore the health of that market has got to be an absolute priority for us as an investor. And so for us, maybe that weighs sometimes the balance against divestment and walking away. But it's perfectly fine that there are other institutions and investors that don't have that same context in us, and so therefore their balance is swung slightly differently. But for us, I think that's kind of a guiding principle that we'll be keeping.
Thank you. And Benny, for you, can divestment or engagement be more effective if we implement it on a large-scale coordinated effort?
Certainly, I would say that, since we run a number of collaborative investor initiatives, wouldn't I? But we hear from the investors we work with, and also from many of the companies with whom we facilitate engagement, that there's a number of benefits to kind of engaging in collaboration with others, and initiatives like CA100 Plus also kind of demonstrate this, and investors appreciate those opportunities to amplify their key messages, to give more weight to their individual asks of companies, to share capacity and reduce duplication of engagement, and overall to be able to engage with a large number of companies through this kind of collaborative effort. They also provide opportunities for knowledge sharing and information sharing, and that can be really important and helpful as well, and improve the quality, I think, of those engagements, and demonstrating that larger interest in what the company is doing can create a greater, stronger incentive for companies to act. We've also heard from companies that they enjoy kind of the opportunity to meet with a group of shareholders altogether. It streamlines the engagement process for them, but also demonstrates to them the level of interest in what they're doing, and so they can hear potentially a wider range of asks than they might hear if they were engaging with kind of individual investors. So, and there's also kind of academic studies and evidence that has demonstrated that a collaborative engagement can improve engagement outcomes. Both the number of shareholders involved in a collaborative engagement, as well as the size of holdings, are equally important. In fact, I think there was some research that showed that the number of investors engaging, even if they're relatively small shareholdings, was even more important. But there's also a potential risk and a potential downside that the larger your coalition, the lower the ambition of the asks that you're able to negotiate and agree amongst you. So that would be a potential downside. So that's on the engagement side. On the divestment side, as I already alluded to previously, I think that divestment by a larger number of investors obviously can help to have a larger impact, and also potentially set social market norms, as well as potentially drive policy change. But of course, if that's a kind of collaborative decision to divest, that would risk breaking antitrust laws, and so decisions about divestment do need to be taken individually by investors. So of course that would be a proviso on that.
Valeria, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yes, I'm glad, Penny, you mentioned it, because that was the first thing, and I actually thought when that question was posed to us, we can't actually have a coordinated approach to divestment. We will all go to jail, so it's acting in concert. But having a coordinated approach to engagement, absolutely yes. And I think, Penny, you really outlined the advantages of these big coalitions, and I think if you all look at the statistics of Climate Action 100+, which has involved more than 700 investors in 5 years to engage with 170 companies, you can see the evidence of the power of being together, especially at the beginning of the conversation on climate change, as companies needed really to have the extra push on better disclosure, better targets, more sophisticated ambitions beyond just net zero by 2050 that looks so much far away in the future. So definitely a big fan of collaborative initiatives and collaborative efforts. More broadly on divestment, I think we will probably take a similar approach to what Railpen said. We are a large asset owner. We are a universal owner. We own a little bit of a slice of the entire economy. So we do care about systemic risk, systemic externalities to the economy, and that's why we take a thematic approach. And we feel that when you're in, you have a voice. When you're out, companies don't care. And companies likely will find someone else who is interested in actually buying those shares. there's plenty of academic research also on the dichotomy between divestment and engagement. There are question marks on actually having any influence on financing cost, any influence on long-term shareholder share price. So if you really want to use divestment to enact change, there's a little bit of a question mark in my view. Maybe tilting could be something in the middle, where, for example, you do slightly underweight exposure to companies that are lagging today, engage, wait for change, and if they change, then you go back and increase your exposure to these companies. And it's quite interesting also the conversation on engagement being used to unlock value. So you might want to invest in a company today that is lagging because you want to work with that company to solve the issue, make it much more expensive when you sell, and you make money out of it. So the economics behind engagement is quite solid. It's not actually a ethical principle, it's pure investment principle. You're just looking for material issues that need to be solved so that actually you protect financial value for your customers.
And Adam, for you, I think if you talk about divestment, there's a lot of negative consequences of it, whether these are wanted or unwanted. So if you look at, for example, fossil fuel companies in particular, what are some of these consequences on fossil fuel prices, and are these things that you take into consideration at all?
In terms of us divesting?
Yep.
Considering about that. Well, I think, as Valeria says, I think some of the research so far has put a big question mark about the economic impact of divestment in of itself. Often that is tied to, does that change the market, the whole thing? It changes your individual portfolio an awful lot in the moment, and for some people that could be very valuable and very helpful and very attuned to their kind of mission of effectively managing risks and opportunities. But as I said about Railpen being very long term, our success is tied to the health of the market over the long term. And so for us, making a change that looks at our portfolio may be different on a short term, day by day, week by week basis, is going to be less impactful in the whole journey of our mission than something that moves the market more effectively towards a net zero future. And so therefore, for us, that probably paints this as slightly less attractive. But I do think when divestment's done well and thoughtfully, it can make a difference. And so I was in a previous life talking to a big asset manager, and they had made a very public pledge around climate, and were using divestment in a tool kind of framework around that. They'd written to a lot of companies, some had started engaging, some hadn't, and they very publicly said, okay, you're out. Within 2 weeks, I think all but one of them magically found the email that they had been sent and were like, oh my gosh, yes, of course, so sorry we missed it, let's get to engaging. And so the way in which they went about the divestment campaign and the way in which they framed it led to a positive outcome. I also looked to people like the church pensions boards who employed a similar time-based engagement tactic, were very clear with their asks, were very clear with their escalation, followed through with it, very, very strong signals and very, very strong efforts. And what they've done is then recycled a lot of their resource and capacity into pushing on other sectors, which again can be is a more effective kind of way in which to distribute resource and effort than one that is just, I'll try this and then I'll stop and I'll do zero afterwards. I'll try this, and if it doesn't work, I'll recycle, I'll push here and I'll push here, and I'll try all these different levers available to me. And I'll also try a little bit at the public policy, because that's got to be hugely important as well. So that's our calculus that we try to do. And yes, at the moment we're full on into the engagement on climate side. Maybe talk to me in a couple of years and it might be different, but for now that's where we are.
Thank you. And Penny, can you share your thoughts on the critique that divestment may end very necessary dialogue with certain companies about their climate action?
So I think, as I said previously, I don't think that has to be the case. And I think that there's a number of investors that have, for example, got these exclusion lists, or rather have got divestment lists that they make public, and they will communicate clearly to a company if they choose to put them onto that divestment list, but be clear about what would take them off that list so that they could potentially be invested in again in the future. And so that kind of clear communication about what is being looked for can be communicated still, even if divestment takes place. And then there are these degrees of divestment, the kind of weighting, underweighting or overweighting of particular companies. So overweighting where a company is perhaps moving, or a company is seen to be able to transition but isn't at the moment kind of showing willing, but actually apply more pressure if you're more heavily invested in that company, and given they've got the potential to move, then that could produce some useful results. And of course it depends on which specific sector or industry you're talking about, because if you're talking about fossil fuels specifically, then that is a bit of a tricky and special sector, given that you're ultimately asking them to move away from their reason for existing rather than the means of production. So that makes it a particularly tricky case potentially.
All right, thank you so much. We don't have any other audience questions left. If anyone still has a question, please send them in. But other than that, I thank you all really a lot for sharing all of your. I started off by saying that from a litigation perspective, I was looking to learn a lot from what you all had to say, and I really did. So it's much appreciated, and I hope everyone else feels the same way. So thank you so much.